Hey y'all, I'm here today with some reflections on my year-long, really about 8-month long read of War and Peace. I'm releasing this video today since it seems like an appropriate time for it, as I'll explain during the review, but I'm still preparing for a best reads of 2024 video as always, which I'll release hopefully sometime in January. So the first point to mention about War and Peace is I finished it, and I didn't even have to bring it along to the New Year's Eve party to get it done. But bringing it back to where it began, I was originally inspired on this read from a video by Claire of Claire Reads Books, who said she was participating in this big year-long slow read of War and Peace led by Simon Haisell on his Substack page. And I thought, you know what, War and Peace has been in the back of my mind for a while. I've always assumed that I would read it someday, and I was even thinking early in this year, of trying a few chapters at some point recently. But this seems like a lot of fun, so I think this is the push that is going to actually make this happen for me. I mean, War and Peace feels like one of those classics that all lovers of literature should read at some point, right? So this gave me the push to get started, although it was basically March by the time I saw that video from Claire, so I came in with a bit of a late start on this one, and spent most of the year catching up as it turned out. And this was the second year of Simon's particular War and Peace read-along, and if this sounds like something that you'd be interested in, I'd encourage you to check out the link that I'll leave in the description section, because Simon is doing it again for one more year in 2025. I think this will be the last time, though, since he's done it several years. And this isn't just a read-along. He does a great job on this. There are chat threads for every day's reading for conversation about the details and questions that people have, and he publishes a really nice weekly update every week that gives some of the historical or cultural context, even just sometimes a YouTube video of a dance that was done by some of the characters in the book, or lots of historical portraits of battle scenes and famous characters. Really enhances the experience overall. And the way this read along works is that you read one chapter a day, because there are really that many chapters that you can make this last the whole year. Each one is fairly short, so you should be able to easily finish it in 30 minutes, even if you're quite a slow reader, and maybe finish it in 10 if you're going at a fairly fast pace and it's an average length chapter. Structurally, this book is broken into 4 parts plus an epilogue, each of which is then broken into, I think, up to 4 books, and each of those books within a part is broken up into somewhere from 15 to 40 short chapters. But the way it adds up is, I think there are roughly 350 chapters or so, so you can do a chapter a day and make it through over the course of the year. Reading the book in this slow way has at least one key advantage and one key disadvantage that I found. By chunking out a manageable amount of the book for each day, an amount short enough that you could basically finish it in a consistent 20-minute block of time that you have somewhere during the day, every day, this gives you the motivation to start what is, I admit, a book of intimidating length, and possibly intimidating for other reasons as well, as I'll mention. On the other hand, once you're doing it, cutting yourself off each day after 20 minutes on some days may slow your momentum, and spacing it out so that you're reading so little of it at a time might actually make it feel a little bit less cohesive for you. Because of this, I think that the slow read format would be actually most ideal for someone who's read the book before and wants to go back through and really savor the individual parts. Because for your first read through, this feels almost as if you're paying too close attention to the little parts if you're reading at this speed. Which is part of the fun of War and Peace, but it definitely feels like it can challenge you on the first read through as well. But this is minor stuff. Overall, I'm really thankful for this read along, because I just don't think I would have taken on the novel this year without this kickstart. And thanks to Claire too for bringing this to my attention and intriguing me about the book. As is often the case, it's hard for me to talk about this novel, because this is one of those novels about which much has been written, much has been said, much has been analyzed. Some of that analysis has seeped into me already through the very process of reading, because I did follow along with Simon's weekly summary posts, reviewing what had happened during the week and providing additional clarifying information and cultural context. So I feel like, what can I even add here? Well, maybe not a whole lot, especially without any particular focus or guiding question. Nevertheless, I will try in some sort of non-comprehensive way to review my impressions or what stood out to me, an overall reflection on my experience reading War and Peace. So War and Peace is kind of notorious for its length and its difficulty. My main prior knowledge point on this book was from A Charlie Brown New Year, where this novel is basically the main antagonist of the whole special, an obstacle that sidelines Charlie Brown at the New Year's Eve party right before his crush, the little redhead girl, shows up Linus gets to dance with her instead because, unsurprisingly, he's read the novel already, as he makes clear to Charlie Brown that it's not a very difficult task, since Tolstoy's wife was able to copy the novel 7 times with a dip pen. Another notorious aspect of War and Peace is that it has these long passages in French, or also occasionally in German, as it turns out, which is historically precise. The Russian aristocracy did speak in both Russian and French at the time, and this is an important cultural dimension to the novel, but also just adds to its inscrutability for first time readers who are less than experts in the French language. And then you can add to these challenges the novel's reputation for having hundreds of recurring characters, all with multiple different names depending on who's referring to them, and Russian names at that, which are not the most immediately tractable for your typical 21st century English speaking audience. Yet, as I began this novel, I quickly discovered that it's not actually so difficult, at least on a surface level, at least not most of the time. We quite plainly see the stories of multiple focal characters in their lives told in a way that is not really so hard to follow. Yes, it does at times become a bit of a memory exercise to keep up with all the minor characters, especially since many of them are to reappear 500 pages later in the book from when they were first mentioned, and especially since some of them are referred to with different names by different characters. But it becomes clear fairly early who most of the major characters will be, even if their relative centrality still isn't quite clear yet. The Rostovs and the Bolkonskis are the families that really take the most central stage, with Pierre Bezukhov added to this mix. I also didn't find the alternate names very difficult, like the nicknames. If anything, simply remembering who was a larger task of the minor characters, and also something that I think is very doable. What was far more challenging for me was trying to piece together and make some coherence out of these generally loosely interwoven, but sometimes suddenly becoming very tightly interwoven character stories, many of which take a while to intersect, even though many of these characters do all cross paths with one another at some point by the end. But this is where the size of the novel really becomes challenging. At times, particularly at these sort of milestones in terms of page numbers or book divisions, like a third of the way through the book, a half of the way through the book, end of book 2, I got this sense of like, I've been so far already. We're following the lives of these characters, but I'm kind of disoriented as to what the overarching story or salient arcs are, or where we're at in this entire narrative. It all feels rather messy in a way that on one hand reflects real life without huge coincidences or dramatic twists or total epiphanies all the time. Well, okay, some characters do have total epiphanies, but they turn out before long to be less profoundly or significantly life-changing than they assume that they are in the moment. They are life-changing in small ways, but not actually earth-shattering or even necessarily permanent for these characters. On the other hand, it can start to feel at times like there are things happening, and then there are other things happening, and then there are more things happening, and then some things happen, and what does it all mean? Well, you tell me. Isn't that life's big question? And amidst this all, there are wars starting and stopping, and then starting again, but then stopping before then starting again. And that's how the Napoleonic Wars actually proceeded. And it's all a bit of a mystery to the characters why this happens, except to those characters who understand perfectly why it happens. But Tolstoy makes it clear to the reader that these characters in reality actually understand nothing about why it happens, and it is pure folly that it even happens at all. Thus, in some ways, while such an ambitious novel manages to achieve something unusual by feeling so expansive and being hard to wrap up and decorate with a bow, it also becomes really challenging in this way. And for me, sometimes a little bit less satisfying. And this is not a nihilistic novel in a typical sense, in that Tolstoy is sure to capture the unexpected beauty and moments of real humanity that present themselves at all courses of life. But it can all feel more than a bit aimless at times, as Tolstoy endeavors to illustrate both the absurdities of war and peace. The novel is also stylistically unusual in that, in addition to painting the portraits of 5 to 10 or so very main characters, it also paints the portraits of many side characters. But beyond even that, almost every chapter contains some sort of mini story or vignette involving some very side characters. There are probably several hundred characters in this book that receive at least some sort of a story, many of whom are rather tangential to the most central characters' lives. And actually, I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on in this review, why I think that might be. And then there's a whole historical dimension to this novel, which is huge. The novel is about the Napoleonic Wars in Russia, and before long, we discover that some of the key characters in this novel are the army generals, the actual army generals from both sides, including Napoleon himself eventually. Tolstoy's juxtaposition of the intrigues and follies and pure coincidences of war with the intrigues and follies and pure coincidences of everyday life is no doubt one of the novel's great strengths and part of its enduring legacy. But Tolstoy also goes into great detail in his historical accounts of battles and diplomacy, sometimes going as far as to reprint actual letters between the key generals. While a comprehensive knowledge of European history, Russian history, and more specifically what was at stake during the Napoleonic Wars is not exactly a prerequisite for this novel, I have the feeling that people who are not very interested in history, or even who are interested in history but find themselves less excited by learning about the precise military conflicts, will struggle a bit through these sections, maybe a lot. In fact, I would go as far as to recommend that anyone reading this novel should follow along in this video documentary series that I watched from the channel Epic History, which describes and illustrates the key battles of the wars, most of which do appear or are at least alluded to within the pages of War and Peace. And it also describes the background context for these conflicts, although it definitely has more of a focus on the military maneuvers of these different battles. I'm putting a link to this video in the description section below in case you're interested in. It's interesting even if you don't read War and Peace. All that said, I like learning about history, and therefore following along with the historical narrative of the Napoleonic Wars really did enhance my enjoyment of this book and what I got out of it. But this all makes for an interesting and unconventional structure to the overall novel. You get these historical commentaries and vignettes that read almost a bit more like historical nonfiction with elements of fiction peppered in, and then you also have these just other more philosophical type chapters in which Tolstoy at times comments on the war and the central plot, while at other times he muses more freely on other odds and ends in a way that feels incredibly open-ended for the novel form. These interludes become increasingly frequent towards the end of the novel, for that matter, on one hand, adding some interest and freshness, but eventually also disorienting the reader and making it seem like the novel's very structure is disintegrating, as if it will never really come to an ending. Which, again, is perhaps a brilliant recognition of the fact that life doesn't really come to a clean end, but also is, like I said, very disorienting a lot of the time. So considering all this, what was my overall experience of the novel? I've really tried to move away lately from a more simplistic I liked it or I didn't like it assessment of novels and instead focus more on lasting impressions and the overall experience, even if in the end there is still some overall positive or negative impression that emerges at the end. And sometimes it's a bit of both. And for this novel, it's really hard to tell what that impression is because it's so long and I read it over such a long span of time that it still feels very mentally fragmented to me. Like if I asked you to rate your whole life story up to this point on a scale of 1 to 5 stars, it feels ridiculous. And I bet Tolstoy would feel the same way about me trying to rate his novel in a similar way. All in all, though, I definitely enjoyed reading this novel while also finding it frustrating, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in not so good ways. Considering all these individual episodes and how particular episodes of these connect and fit with one another together, there are many that I absolutely loved. There's also a lot in here that still feels very fragmented to me, and I don't know if that means that I need to sit with it for longer, I need to read it again, or if I'm just looking for a sort of cohesiveness that I'm never going to fully find in this novel. But as a whole, it's not that this novel didn't leave an impression on me, it's just more diffuse of an impression than something like, say, Steinbeck's East of Eden did, or for example, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment did, even though it was 15 years ago that I read that one. Not that those are simple novels in any way either. They just sort of had a more cohesive impact by the end. War and Peace left many little disconnected impressions here and there, which have started to form some connections and maybe will continue to form others. But at the end of the day, I can't really say I loved it in the sense that I've loved some things that I've read, but it is a good one. Moving beyond that more high-level assessment, though, let's now get into some of the actual characters. Which characters did I like? Which ones did I connect with? What were my impressions of them? Which characters did I personally identify with? Well, let's start with that one. Which characters did I personally identify with? Well, basically all of them. but also none of them fully. And I think this is a really good thing because these are complex characters more than archetypes. So there's characters in which I can see a lot of myself in them, but there's also a lot there that I can't see or I can't relate to in the same way. Not to mention aspects of the personalities of these characters that I just still don't really fully understand and grasp why they behave the way they did, even though it's not that they behaved uncharacteristically. It's more that I just don't fully understand their character well enough to understand why they behave that way, you know. And there are even characters where I can strongly identify with some certain part of their life story, but not so much with other parts. There were a few main characters that I really liked. Natasha, Maria, and Pierre come to mind. For many of the others, I was a bit more, not ambivalent, but never really as fully drawn into them on this read. But let's just start going through some of them. So starting with Pierre, I guess I will say Pierre is an excellent character. I'm not sure how much I really like him, liked him on a more personal sense, but I mean, of course I did like him because he's one of the most lovable characters in the novel. He's not to say this in a reductive way, but he's kind of like lovable in a Winnie the Pooh sort of way that at the start of the novel is actually a little bit pathetic, but I would also argue that this at times makes him one of the most frustrating characters because there are these scenes where you're like, dude, what are you doing? Someone needs to just come in and slap this guy to get him out of his own made up inner world and back into the world around him. And from a novelistic perspective, I'm realizing that maybe this is part of why Natasha is an attractive partner for him because she's someone who she does have all sorts of fanciful notions, particularly at the start of the novel, but in general, she seems to be less caught up in all the what ifs and all this intellectual planning and scheming that we see from the other characters. And instead, she just goes with the flow with what's immediately here in a way that is very endearing, but at times has real consequences. But Natasha and her way of viewing the world kind of helped to bring Pierre out of his convoluted internal prison in which he often finds himself stuck. In talking about the characters, though, I will say that this is now going to be a spoiler-filled section of the review. So if you are thinking of reading this novel and you're concerned that you're going to learn something that you don't want to learn, you should come back and watch the rest later, much later, probably. But I guess why Pierre is such a frustrating character is because we have this sense of his goodness all along. For me, he's frustrating because I identify with him closely in a way with his tendency to get lost and confused in his thoughts, all while unmistakably having a good heart and good intentions along the way. And he has this idealism, which for Pierre is unfortunately most of the time totally detached from action, but allows him to find solace purely in ideas that he will never actuate. I'm not quite like Pierre in that regard, but I can very much see the appeal to this sort of way of conceptualizing the world. He's frustrating in a way that, for example, the Kuragins, like his wife Helene or his brother-in-law Anatole, never will be because we don't expect any better from them in the first place. But we do expect better from Pierre, to whom so much has been given, including a strong moral conscience. I mean, one of the most maddening, someone please slap some sense into this guy scenes is at the Battle of Borodino, where Pierre basically comes to the battle as a war tourist to see what this war stuff is all about. And in this absurd chain of events, though understandable knowing Pierre, he's basically sitting here in this dreamlike state, having the time of his life, chatting with the soldiers in the battalion and appreciating the aesthetic qualities of a real military battle, all while others around him are dropping dead in one of the in the bloodiest day of conflict in the entire Napoleonic Wars, and he himself is at times feet away from being crushed by cannonballs. So, yeah, Pierre, great character, very frustrating, but I would argue in a very good way, a character that I'd enjoy getting to know better through a reread. Speaking of which, another character who I'd enjoy getting to know better, because I still don't feel I have a great grasp of him after this whole read through the novel, is Andrei Bolkonsky. He's also very intellectual or focused in the world of ideas, but unlike Pierre, he does not really find any solace in these ideas in themselves, and therefore he keeps himself constantly busy to distract himself. I also identify with Andrei and the Bolkonskys. They're all sort of emotionally self-repressive, really placing a lot of trust in their mind, but nevertheless often acting quite irrationally and quite emotionally in the end anyway, and not really understanding themselves or where their actions and reactions are coming from. My description of the characters, of course, I should say, these are all somewhat reductive because these describe some actions and some behaviors of the characters, but not all of them. Tolstoy really resists making easily decipherable characters in his novel. Andre, though, I feel I had a more limited understanding of him because you kind of have to read between the lines with him. Pierre, by contrast, is a character where, especially when you see his thoughts, he's somewhat of an open book. It's clear what he's experiencing and how he's feeling about it, even if he's not processing it in the most productive way, and even if his emotional reactions sometimes seem totally out of tune with the reality of the world around him. Andre, though, even when you get a close look at him, just feels like he himself is not fully aware of everything he's experiencing. There are moments of being moved by the world around him, but he struggles to understand them and frequently falls short when he tries. Because of this, he's happiest when he gets swept into activities in an abstract realm of thought that really engage this intellectual capacity of his and convert it into some sort of productive activity, and in which he doesn't have to rely too much on the deeper questions of why he's doing it or how he feels about the broader world. He simply enjoys the excitement of, for example, drawing up battle plans or working out legislative policies without really looking too closely at how he's feeling about it all. And perhaps for the same reason, you also can see how in his relationships, whether his relationship with his very good friend Pierre, or in a romantic relationship with Natasha that develops later in the book, he is really at his best and his happiest when he is fully present with the other person. And some of the most powerful scenes in the book are actually in scenes where Andre is there with the other person and they're just together in the same mental space. But when he becomes separated from these other characters physically, this distance seems to have sort of a depressing effect on him, and he loses or forgets what it is that he valued in these relationships until he becomes reunited with them again. It feels like Andre, more than others, is one of those people who has to keep himself busy to avoid realizing that he's unhappy. But I still feel like my examination of Andre here is less incisive or less on point than my look into Pierre. I think there's a lot about Andre that I still don't understand, that I didn't understand well enough to really captivate me and to really frustrate me on the same level that Pierre did. Another really intriguing character, and one of my personal favorites, was Andre's sister, Princess Maria. Maria takes a while to really step into her fullest role in this novel, which I think is quite appropriate because this mirrors her overall life situation, in which she is trapped by societal and family constraints into a position where she must subordinate her own aspirations in favor of her family duties, such as taking care of her father, whose health is rapidly deteriorating. In Maria, I hugely appreciated this tension of being torn between this duty, which is driven by love fundamentally, but is unrewarding in any sense beyond the fulfillment of knowing that you are loving and caring for another person. She's torn between that duty and a deeper wish to escape the constraints in which she lives and to venture out into the broader world. To modern readers, she may be too self denying at times, but she also illustrates the rewards and the admirability of this self denial and manages to know herself in a way that I think most of the other characters in this novel really don't achieve in the same way. He's also a very admirable character who you can pretty much immediately see is one of strong personal character. One of those very many little parts in this novel that really moved me was, well, for setting the background a bit, we're told by everyone right from the start when they see Maria that she has a very plain appearance, which at first almost seems as if it's a euphemism for, well, she's ugly, although that doesn't quite seem to be the case, as we learn. But nevertheless, her best prospects of marriage seem to come from the fact that she's a member of the nobility, so she does have some wealth. And in fact, in her encounter with the morally bankrupt Anatole Kuragin, who quite plainly holds no real admiration for her, we readers fear that she may be roped into a marriage of convenience for him that really offers her nothing, and he's kind of a good for nothing guy on top of that. But then, well into the novel, there is a scene in which the dashing and chivalrous Nikolai Rostov helps her and her household to flee Moscow as the French are approaching the city, and the serfs of the Bolkonsky estate are staging some sort of a mutiny. We're shown here how Nikolai immediately recognizes some greater depth to her that renders her physical appearance less important, or at the very least paints a fuller picture of who she is, presents her in a different and very favorable light. And I like to think we've all had some sort of experience like this of meeting someone who you can pretty much sense immediately possesses a certain depth and sincerity and strength of character that maybe isn't visible always or to everyone, but when you do see it, like if you're someone who knows and you have an awareness of this, you know already with absolute confidence that you like and respect this person within, a few seconds or minutes of meeting them. In fact, as Nikolai is a pretty complicated character, often portrayed as an adventurer and almost a bit of a philanderer, his immediate recognition of Maria as someone special is a major positive tally on his moral scoreboard. Of course, the wonderful thing about this scene is that it's even much more complicated than that. How much of it is Maria's goodness and strength of character that he's recognizing, and how much of it is just the romantic, starry-eyed thrill of Nikolai for rescuing a damsel in distress, whomever she may be. He is a Rostov after all, so we know he's susceptible to such influences. And add to that the obvious other implication of this scene, which is that if an attachment does form between Maria and Nikolai, then it means his poor cousin Sonia, to whom he's promised himself long ago, will be doomed to watch him marry another woman of greater fortune. Nikolai, also a very interesting character in the dilemmas that he faces, in which you almost always can sympathize with him and criticize him at the same time. And the romances of War and Peace are never really cast as being complete wins for everyone. Even with the more appropriately matched couples, there is always a somebody else or some downside to the match that defies any simplistic romantic happily ever after narrative. The final romantic attachment of the novel between Pierre and Natasha, for example, is bittersweet. Natasha has clearly lost some of that youthful innocence and that zest for life and has adopted more of a homely, matronly role. While we can be sure that Pierre is good to her in many ways, this relationship lacks the fiery passion of her earlier romances, for better and for worse. It sort of feels like in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility when Marianne, by the end of the novel, has calmed down and gained a bit more sense, and it leads her to a perfectly acceptable partnership with a man who she does not love passionately, but she believes she may come to really love someday nevertheless for his other qualities. It's indeed hard to watch Natasha's transformation by the end of the novel. I'm not saying this transformation is necessarily all for the worse, but Natasha is one of my favorite characters throughout the novel, and interestingly, probably the character I have the least in common with of the main characters. Emotional, impulsive, enjoying the pleasures of life, albeit too swept up in them at times, she and the other Rostovs present a stark contrast to many of the more cerebral types we encounter in other families in War and Peace. In Natasha's main scenes, where she captivates the other characters with her dancing, singing, and general charisma, I feel captivated too. She draws us into perhaps viewing the world just a little more openly, with less rigidity and a greater sense of possibility. And then in other moments, she is harshly disillusioned about her overly trusting view of the world. In a way, she sort of shows us that although most of us may not experience life's up and downs with the same intensity and emotion that Natasha does, perhaps we have to be willing to experience that fall and that disillusionment at times in order to open up to life's joys and surprises in the first place. And in thinking about these characters, I've now really realized how much the characters' presence within the novel or absence at many times really mirrors their personality. I already alluded to how Maria basically occupies a backseat for the first half of the novel or so, but I'm now seeing similar connections for other characters. The bold and reckless Nikolai always enters with a bang in some sort of decisive action, while Prince Andrei typically makes a less ceremonious entrance and occupies relatively fewer pages, though still a good number and still making some impression, a sort of dignified impression while he's there. Pierre, as the wealthy heir and the center of everyone's attention, especially his own, probably gets the most pages out of anyone in this novel, an attention that he doesn't seem to really crave or actively seek out, but that he clearly does enjoy nevertheless, even if he's not aware of it. It's hard to ever feel too sorry for Pierre when you see the way that he's treated by others on account of his large fortune. And Natasha, one of the most memorable characters of the novel, achieves this not by appearing on a disproportionate number of pages. It's just that every time she's around, she's captivating the attention of everyone in the room. Women in general receive fewer pages than men overall in the novel, and servants or poorer characters generally also receive shorter and more minor roles, which I guess we could examine from a lot of different angles, but it certainly does mirror the characters' roles in society. The women, particularly the less affluent ones like Anna Mikhailovna, have to make everything that they can out of the page count that they're given. Anna Pavlovna earns pages by inviting different men and women of society to her salon, at least at this point in her life. Count and Countess Rostov start out the novel with some of the flashiest chapters, but recede into a more feeble background position by the end of the novel as their fortune dwindles. The sneaky Vasily Kuragin and the Kuragins in general aren't there in the foreground very often. You kind of just notice every so often that they're sneaking and scheming in the background, and most of our knowledge of them is obtained through the rumor mill via other characters. It's like they don't want to be seen, they don't want to be the main characters, they just want to get their way and get out of the spotlight. All right, so those are many of the outstanding key characters in this novel. I'm getting around to wrapping things up now, but there are a ton of other great minor characters in this novel, some of whom I think deserve a special mention. I won't talk about them, but if you know, you know. Count Rostopchin, the Weasley mayor of Moscow, who is in too deep and will throw anyone under the bus at this point to save his neck. Captain Tushin, the pipe-smoking artillery commander who operates his battery of cannons with mechanical focus and precision like a clock, even while pandemonium ensues around him and his compatriots flee the enemy. Dolokhov, the man of mysterious motivations who spells trouble just about any time he appears, and yet surprisingly somehow doesn't quite come across ever as an inherently evil, as a character with his track record usually would. Anna Mikhailovna, who will pull whatever strings she can and willingly humiliate herself to give her son Boris a favorable start in life. All of these characters add so much color to this expansive novel. And coming to mind right now, even though I didn't note him down, is of course Denisov, the head of the Hussar regiment, who really appears many times in this novel and almost is not even a minor character, but always adds a lot of color to whatever situation, and makes a fool of himself a little bit as he's there too, but is really a lovable guy as well. Now, wrapping things up, I'm still not sure the book quite justified its massive length by the end of it all. In fact, my immediate impressions upon finishing the book were, I think, a bit less favorable than they've settled out to be overall, and this isn't helped by the fact that towards the end of the novel, all of the main characters begin to move more and more into the background, it seems, and the new central characters that emerge to play the center role in Part 4 and for the epilogue are Napoleon and Tolstoy himself. Simon Haisell, in one of his Substack posts for the Slow Read, described Tolstoy as basically presenting himself as an additional flawed character in the novel. And towards the end of the novel, Tolstoy begins to become kind of pedantic, particularly in an 18-chapter epilogue that reads more like it's trying to be a mathematical or logical proof or a philosophical treatise of sorts, more than any fitting conclusion to a novel. And that's the thing. There are contexts in which this sort of an ending might make sense, but a lot of Tolstoy's musing at this point are just repetitive. I know it's hard for me to criticize a great novel like this, particularly because there are many structural or narrative aspects to it that undoubtedly I just haven't noticed or grasped. Still, I feel like as great of a novel as this is, many of these points could have been achieved with greater impact in a novel that was just a bit tighter. Not way shorter or way trimmed, but still long enough to have that expansive feeling to it and give time to write it in this open-ended way, but a bit shorter in a way that could add a little bit more cohesion to it all. Nevertheless, I can understand that Tolstoy did really achieve something revolutionary with this novel in ways that I don't fully appreciate myself, at least not yet, but that I admire, and therefore this novel will occupy a place in my mind for years to come. And also, hopefully, for a bit longer this year, because I'm planning now to watch the 20-episode 1972 War and Peace TV series, which I believe was made for the BBC, featuring Anthony Hopkins as Pierre. Let me know if I'm really making a mistake here, but it does just feel like if I'm going to watch a TV or film adaptation of this novel, it really has to be one that takes its time to get there. This is not going to be achieved in a 4-hour film or anything like that. It's just not possible for this novel. With that, Happy New Year to all of you. I hope you're doing well, and let me know if you have any ambitious reading projects of your own for this year. I mean, I think this is really a good time to get started on such a project because, really what I mean is that if there's a long book that you've been meaning to read for a while, but that has just felt too long or unapproachable or intimidating, now is a great time to consider jumping in and just allowing yourself the time that it takes, but making a little bit of steady progress each day or almost every day. And it doesn't have to be the only thing you read. I read plenty of other stuff alongside War and Peace, which was admittedly a bit distracting at times, but also prevented me from ever feeling stuck or trapped in this 1,300-page novel, which would be a shame because it is worth getting to the end of it, or at least to the end of everything except the epilogue. I myself was not planning yet on doing any particular slow read like this in 2025, but one novel that comes to mind that I'm considering taking on is Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, undoubtedly one of the other great classics of Russian literature and of literature in general. But that one will be pretty short compared to this one, so I don't need to even start on it just yet. Plus, I've been meaning to tackle Jane Austen's Mansfield Park for a while now and have just gotten started on that. So let's take it one thing at a time. Anyway, thanks for watching and happy reading.